Good morning, everyone. This is Sean Illingworth, and I'm coming to you from the class of 1948 recording booth at the Rutgers Oral History Archives Center. It is my pleasure to now present this year's Stephen Ambrose Oral History Award to renowned writer Daniel James Brown. Dan, you have earned this award due to your extensive use of oral histories and other first-person perspectives in your works. You now join the many other writers, academics, filmmakers, and oral historians who have received this prestigious award for advancing the use of oral history in telling captivating stories from our past. Congratulations. And now I believe you have a few comments to share with our attendees.
Well, thank you, Sean. And my apologies for not being there in person. I would have preferred that. Travel to the East Coast has just become really difficult for me. So I appreciate this opportunity to do this virtually. Yeah, I have a few remarks I'd like to make. First, of course, I'd like to thank the committee for bestowing this honor on me. It's particularly meaningful to me because, of course, it has its roots in Stephen Ambrose's work. I've been writing a narrative history for almost 25 years now. And my impetus for beginning to do so was really my admiration for a number of books that were published in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Among those were Laura Hillenbrand's The Seabiscuit, Eric Larson's Isaac Storm, Nathaniel Philbrick's In the Heart of the Sea, and of course, Undaunted Courage. So I've long considered myself indebted to Professor Ambrose, as well as those others I've mentioned in particular, both for giving me the inspiration to make the attempt at this kind of writing and for teaching me so much about how to go about doing it. So I would like to say a few words about my use of oral history in particular. I've published 4 books over that 25 years, and all of them have been built primarily on a foundation of oral histories, either those assembled in an earlier era by someone else or those that I've been able to collect myself. My first book, Under a Flaming Sky, began with my close perusal of a book entitled Memorials of the Minnesota Fires in 1894 by a gentleman named the Reverend William Wilkinson. And that book's simply a compendium of firsthand eyewitness accounts of the great Hinckley firestorm of that same year. And it's particularly, although it's very badly organized, the accounts are very vivid because he collected those accounts in the weeks and months right after that fire. So, and then my second book, In Different Stars Above, sprang originally from sort of a lifelong interest in the Donner Party story. But that lifelong interest began many years ago when I read a book titled The History of the Donner Party by a fellow named C.F. McGlashan. And that book was published in 1879. And again, it's simply a compendium of accounts of that tragedy provided sometimes reluctantly by the survivors. My third book, The Boys in the Boat, was built mostly on my own interviews with the principals in that story, but even more with close family members of those principals. And then my fourth book, Facing the Mountain, grew out of and is built on dozens of video taped oral histories collected by a gentleman named Tom Ikeda in Seattle. And Tom has collected these interviews over 25 years and made them all available on his website at densho.org. And by the way, Tom's a remarkably good interviewer. And if anybody has any interest in learning more about the firsthand experiences of Japanese Americans during the World War II years, you won't regret any time you spend looking and exploring the Densho website. Now, my research for these books, of course, also included many other kinds of sources, newspaper articles, scientific data, other books, military records, correspondence, and so on. But firsthand accounts are at the heart of each of them, and each of them would, in my opinion, have considerably less heart if they'd been constructed any other way. And it's heart that I'd like to take a couple minutes to talk about today. In this time we're living through, when history, factual history, is under assault, when books are banned for ideological reasons, when uncomfortable narratives are suppressed, when false historical narratives are promoted for political reasons. Um, Facts and the truth have really never been so important. Now, we all know that oral histories themselves are not always factual. They may be riddled with misremembering, with conflation, with the speaker's own agenda or biases. And so the honest writer's task is, of course, to hold those firsthand accounts up to the light, to test them against other accounts and other sources of information, and just to discern what is and isn't true. The writer must discard what is untrue, but at the same time recognize that just because an account may be in part untrue, that same account may, and often does, contain emotional truths that must not be discarded, that are in fact the most valuable part of those accounts. In my opinion, history has to be more than the simple telling of facts. It must capture the human element, the human condition, the truths that transcend the facts and speak directly to the human heart. So only the eyewitness, I think, who's lived through a true firestorm, for instance, can really know and therefore tell us what it's like to see and hear a tornado of fire rip through one's own hometown. Only someone who has been snowbound and come close to the very verge of starvation can convey to us what that feels like. Only someone who's won an Olympic gold medal can share that level of exaltation with us. And only someone who has watched her grandmother being taken away and incarcerated in a bleak concentration camp can move us to understand her pain. When I was researching the boys in the boat, my principal source, and by far and away the person I spent the most time with interviewing, was Joe Rance's daughter, Judy. Joe Rance is the principal character in that book, principal figure in that book. Judy, his daughter, had spent the last several years of her father's life questioning him, taking notes, and recounting in minute detail the circumstances of his life growing up during the Great Depression, his experiences learning to row at the University of Washington, and the crew's triumphant gold medal win at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. So I spent many, many hours with Judy, and she was able to provide me with a cornucopia of facts, anecdotes, and insights into Joe's character, the world he lived in, and his unique experiences. But here's the thing. In almost every session I spent with Judy, there came a point at which she suddenly choked up and tears came to her eyes, and she had to pause before continuing. And those moments were like gold to me as a writer. Those were the moments when I could feel Joe's humanity, could feel his hopes and fears most acutely. And those were the moments I knew I needed to come back to probe gently, and to understand completely if I were to tell the story well, because that was where the heart of the story lay. The great enduring value of oral histories is that at some point, someone has sat down, looked into someone else's eyes, asked that someone for their story, and captured at least a slice of the human condition. And that, for me, is what writing history is all about. So again, I want to thank you so much for your appreciation of my work and for bestowing this honor on me. It means a great deal to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those moving remarks. Now I'd like to ask you a few questions. What did you do before you became a history writer? How did you make the transition to full-time history writing?
So I was an English major in college, and I got an MA in English literature, and literature was really my passion. I didn't read a lot of history when I was at university. So I wound up teaching college English for 12, 15 years. And then when I got married, and my wife was pregnant, we needed a little more income than I could make teaching. So I wound up working as a technical editor and writer, first in Silicon Valley and then at Microsoft. So I did that for quite a few years, and so I made the transition to becoming a writer of history. In those last couple of years, I was working as a technical editor. I wanted to see if I could write history. My uh, my grandfather had lived through this terrible fire in Minnesota in the 1890s, and I knew my mother had told me that story, and she had a box of old clippings and documents and this book that I mentioned in the talk. So I just sat down and I got immersed in that particular historical event, and really without knowing anything more about how to get a book published or anything, I went to Minnesota. I started researching it, and I just over a course of 2 years, I just sort of wrote the book, not knowing that I needed an agent and a publisher and all that to actually get it into the world. But eventually, I found an agent, and she sold that book for a very small amount of money, and that's really how it took off. It was really intended as sort of a hobby, but it took off. That book did reasonably well. It got the attention of a bigger publisher, and so things just sort of turned on and got rolling at that point, and it became a career that I hadn't really expected, but I've enjoyed very much.
Do you have a particular approach to your research and writing?
Yeah, I always hesitate to recommend my writing process to anybody because it's very messy and chaotic, and it's not very efficient. That said, I do sort of have some uh, a basic sort of process I go through. I always start once I am pretty committed to writing a particular story or book. I generally start by spending quite a bit of time just constructing a timeline of every event from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. And that sometimes takes me a year or more doing research, finding all the key points in the story, putting them on a timeline. And then at some point, I stand back from that and I look at the timeline, I look at the arc of the story, and I start pulling out the most essential points in the story so that I'm not necessarily including, in fact, I'm not including most of what's on my timeline usually, but I'm pulling out the events and the situations I think readers really would profit from knowing more about, and it will make for a good, compelling story. And then, at that point, I just basically I write uh, scene one, scene two, scene three. I tend to write in chunks I think of as scenes. I'm a very visual kind of thinker, and so I literally think of myself as being behind a camera, um, filming scenes whenever I can. I mean, there's periods, of course, where I'm pulling in expository material also. But for the most part, I construct my books as a series of visual scenes, which I think works well for readers, and it works for me as a writer at any rate.
I liked what you said about the pros and cons of using oral history. Have the oral histories ever caused you to question or rethink an event that you thought you knew definitively? Or did they ever lead you down a new surprising path in your narratives?
Yeah, both. My most recent book is about the Japanese American experience during World War II. And I grew up in the West Coast. My father was in the flower business. I've always had many Japanese American friends, and I felt that I pretty much knew the story of what happened to the Japanese Americans uh, during that period of history. But when I got on the Densho website and started listening to, watching these oral histories that Tom Ikeda has recorded, I realized how much I did not know about that experience, how much only people who had lived through it really knew. Um, and so those interviews were enormously eye-opening for me, and the story opened up whole new understanding for me of what had happened. So that was certainly one instance. Then in terms of unexpected surprises, I think another example is when I was writing The Boys in the Boat. Judy, Joe Rance's daughter, kept mentioning this guy named George Pocock who built the boats that the boys raced in. And I kept wondering, why is she talking about the guy that built the boats? I don't care about the guy that built the boats. That's not my story. Um, but then she kept bringing him up. So finally, I did sort of a deep dive and I went and met his son and talked to him. And it turned out he was this enormously important part of this story. So I would never have known that just by reading what was in print already. It was only because Judy kept coming back to the importance of this guy and the effect that he had on the story that I went down it, and that's always fun, as a writer of this of sort. It's wonderful when you dive into a project, and sometimes projects just sort of peter out. There isn't as much story there as you thought there would be there. Particularly with the boys in the boat, it was a situation where new doors kept opening as I got to know Judy and talked to the some of the other young men who'd rowed and their families. So it was a very rewarding experience in terms of just doors opening up that I didn't expect at all.
Your works often deal with the American West, either as a space itself or the people who hail from there. Are there themes that you see running through your works pertaining to the story of the West?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly very much a product of the West. I've spent my whole life on the West Coast. I love Western landscapes. In fact, as a writer, I tend to write too much about landscape, and my editors usually have to pare me back on that. So I like to write about sagebrush, very Western things. Um, but more broadly, yeah, I mean, I'm drawn to um, the idea of uh, the West as a land of opportunity, to the idea of the pioneering spirit, to the idea of individuals confronting obstacles, particularly in outdoor settings, physical objects. Um, so all those things are interesting to me. I'm also, though, interested in, like, at the same time questioning some of those. So when you talk about manifest destiny, which we see at work, of course, in Undaunted Courage and many other places, um, I, 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 I like to both appreciate that impulse, but also like critique it and explore the downsides of that zeal for conquering the West. What the cost was to humans and to the land, and so yeah, I would say that all those kind of traditional Western themes interest me a lot.
Since your reading habits led in part to your writing career, what are you reading these days, and what do you see yourself writing about in the future?
So I continue to sort of read the same kind of thing that I write. I mean, I read recreationally also. I've actually just been reading the Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove series, which I had not read earlier in my life, and enjoying that. But mostly what I read is narrative nonfiction and narrative history. So I just recently read David Grann's Killers of the Flower Moon, and also another book he wrote, The Wager, which is terrific. Um, I like to read Hampton Sides, and he recently wrote a book called The Wide, Wide Sea about Captain Cook's voyages. And then a book I particularly like by another Seattle writer, Timothy Egan, wrote a book called A Fever in the Heartland about the rise of the KKK. And, uh, and I think that's just an astonishingly good book. So, except for sort of random reading in fiction, mostly what I read is the kind of thing that I aspire to write. In terms of what I might write in the future, I'm really not sure. I'm having a lot of trouble with my vision, and I'm not sure I can undertake another big research project. So if something comes along that really, really, really grabs me, I might not be able to resist. But I don't have any plans right now to dive into another project.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, to present you with the award. And you know, our society is deeply grateful to you and your work. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Sean. And again, sorry I couldn't be there, but I appreciate it.